Hello, everyone, and welcome to Project by Project Demystifying the 2020 Census virtual event. My name is Dao Kim, and I'm part of the events committee here at Project by Project. And today we are joined by Elizabeth OuYang and Howard Shih, who will be discussing the census and why it's so important and its impact to the Asian American community. Now, if you're not familiar with Project by Project, PBP for short, is a nonprofit organization that's focused on empowering the Asian American community through leadership development and innovative philanthropy. Each year, PBP selects a different theme to focus on, and with the election and census taking place this year, 2020's theme is around civic engagement and political empowerment. To learn more about who we are and the work we do, you can visit projectbyproject.org, where you'll find ways to get involved and support our mission. I'd like to thank our sponsors for partnering with us on this event, and they are Apex for Youth, Taiwanese American Professionals NY, Subtle Asian Life NYC, the Museum of Chinese in America, and the Asian American Federation. Now, a quick disclaimer before we get started. This is a recorded virtual event, and PBP reserves the right to utilize this footage. So let's go over the agenda for today. Liz OuYang will be talking about the census and why it matters. Then we'll hand it off to Howard Shih to talk about the Asian American Federation's reports, the public policy impact, and the response from the Asian American population. Then we'll have a Q&A session, and for that portion, we'll be utilizing the Zoom chat feature. So throughout the presentation portion, if you have any questions, feel free to drop in those questions into the chat, and we'll be taking a look at them at the end. And of course, utilize the chat space during the Q&A portion for Q&A. Then after the Q&A, we'll be wrapping it up with just a few words. So just to give you a quick preview of the content to come, I just wanted to talk about some of the aspects that are interesting to me, just to get you all a bit more excited than you already are about today's topic. So I'm sure you've all heard about what the census is and what questions are asked. And hopefully most of you, or if not all, have filled out the census by now. But you might have wondered how that information is used to then benefit society. Well, let's talk about what's really at stake here. And it turns out the allocation of billions of dollars of funding is determined by the census, and also the number of seats in Congress are determined by the census as well. So you can say that in a way, the census is the community's voice and a way that we can be heard as a population. And with that, I'll be introducing Elizabeth OuYang. And Liz is an educator, a civil rights activist, and civic engagement lawyer. She teaches at Columbia University and New York University. And in 2000, she was appointed by President Clinton to be a special assistant to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Liz.
Okay. So the notice that you received from the federal government asked you to complete the census by April 1st. And you should have completed the census with the address you were living on at April 1st. If you have not completed it, because of COVID-19, the Census Bureau has extended the self-response deadline to October 31st, 2020. However, beginning August 11th, till October 31st, census enumerators will begin knocking on people's doors who have not completed the census. So it's if you don't want people knocking on your door, you should complete the census before August 11th. And the Census Bureau extended the deadline when the census results must be delivered to the United States President to April 30th, 2021. So these results will be delivered after the 2020 elections. Okay.
All right, and thank you, Liz. So next up, we have Howard Shih, who is a research and policy director for the Asian American Federation. Howard has authored and co-authored reports on Asian Americans, and Howard oversees the Federation Census Information Center, which is officially designated by the Census Bureau as a repository of census data for improving data access to underserved communities. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Howard.
Thank you, Dow, and thank you for Project by Project for hosting this session, and thank you, Liz, for being a co-panelist. I think what we heard from her was that there was a lot of, a lot of reasons why the Asian community has historically been undercounted, and why it's important to participate in the census. I want to share my perspective in terms of how the Federation uses this data, and how it's important for representation, and how we use the data to advocate on behalf of our communities. A little bit about the Federation. We're a leadership organization that works with about 70 different social service agencies that provide services to the Asian community. And we do that in a variety of ways, from leadership development to technical assistance on helping them do board development, fundraising, and also policy advocacy work that I'm in charge of as the research and policy director. We do research that's based on the census data in the American Community Survey, and we do that through our official designation as a Census Information Center, and working with the Census Bureau to ensure communities that historically haven't used the census data have access to it. And we use that data to advocate on behalf of our communities for more funding, more social, more culturally appropriate services, and you'll see why it's really vital that we have accurate information so that we can better serve our communities. So I'll show you a little bit about how the census is also a historic document. It's really important to be able to show the growth in our communities. This is a map of the Asian community in 1980. The scales between this and the subsequent slides that I'm going to show are exactly the same. So you see there's very few really dark red areas, mainly in Chinatown, Manhattan, a little bit in Elmhurst, and you see Flushing starting to emerge as well in the 80s as central hubs for the Asian community. Sunset Park is just starting to get a hint of red, or medium red, and then if you move to 30 years later, in 2010, you see that the Asian community has pretty much spread throughout the metro area. You see large concentrations in South Brooklyn now, you see Chinatown, you see Jersey City, Elmhurst, Jackson Heights, you see Richmond Hill, South Ozone Park, you see Flushing and Bayside and all of those areas. And the suburbs are seeing increasing growth of the Asian community. And the next slide is, the most recent population estimates that the Census Bureau does between censuses. They use the 2010 census, and they take births, deaths, and migration patterns, and they estimate what the population is now. You'll see that they predict continued growth, particularly in the suburbs of the Asian community. But you also notice that there's a lot of areas where we have no information, whereas in the census, we do have that information. If I go back a slide, you see we have there are at least 1 to 100 Asians in almost every census tract. But if you're collecting sample data, survey data, you're always going to have holes. And that's why it's really important for us to have a complete and accurate count of every census. It's also important the census is one of the only sources of disaggregated data on the Asian community. And because of the different needs of each community, different languages spoken, different economic backgrounds, it's really important to have that information as well. And here I'm going to show you a few Asian ethnic groups that show different settlement patterns. In the Chinese population in 1880, we see Chinatown, we see Elmhurst and the beginnings of Flushing. 30 years later, we see the emergence of many, many new Chinatowns throughout the metro area, as well as in the different 5 boroughs. And again, we're seeing the Chinese population has been growing and is expected to have a major splash in the 2020 census as well. If we move on to the Filipino community in 1980, you see there's really not that much of a Filipino community at this point. You see the seeds that are growing in Jersey City. You see some in and in the Elmhurst area, but it's only hints. 30 years later, you see Jersey City, you see Elmhurst, you see in Bergen County growing communities of Filipinos. And again, the 2018 estimates from last year show continued growth in Long Island and New Jersey. But again, you're seeing areas where we don't have information, and that's why it's important to have a complete count every 10 years. The Indian populations in the South Asian community have been the fastest growing portion of the Asian population. And so in 1980, you're seeing hints of populations throughout the metro area, but nothing major yet. 30 years later, you see lots of new neighborhoods. You see South Ozone Park and Richmond Hill in that southeast portion of Queens. You see growing communities out in Nassau County and Long Island, and down in Middlesex County in New Jersey as well. And then the 2010 estimates again show continued growth, continued predicted growth, and so that's what we're going to be expecting for the 2020 census. The Korean population again shows similar pattern, well, different patterns, but you got Flushing, emerging populations in Flushing and Elmhurst, and the hints of what's going to happen 30 years later. And now 30 years later, you see Bergen County, you see growth in Nassau County and Westchester, and continued concentrations in Northeast Queens. And the 2018 estimates show the continued growth, and also shows again the limits of survey data. So what do we do with this information? The quality of the census data is really important for us because we use it to drive the research the research products that we do. We've done research looking at Asian entrepreneurship in the metro area, and looking at what the percentage of people are who are working or are self-employed, and be able to advocate on behalf of small businesses for language assistance. We have used the census data to track the growth in the Asian senior community as the first generation of immigrants from post-1965 immigration reforms are aging into their senior population. There's a rapidly growing need for senior services that are culturally appropriate. And then the poverty report that we did 2 years ago to advocate on behalf of our communities. And then we're having successes. We're having, for example, the city council created maybe about 5 years ago, new discretionary funding to help fund innovative immigrant senior serving programs. And that's largely because we were able to show in the census data the rapidly growing needs of the community. So it's really important to have this high quality data, and that's why we are participating through different coalitions such as APIA, Complete Count Committee, to ensure that the Asian community is responding to the census. I want to talk a little bit about the data that's available to help us identify key areas that we need to do census outreach in. So there's these three resources. They're different maps that show different demographic statistics through the previous census as well as the American Community Survey to identify where Asians or in other socioeconomic groups are living, what their challenges are in terms of language, in terms of internet access and things like that. And then overlaid on top of that is what is now real-time census response rates. So with that, we can sort of analyze the data that's coming out in real time. And we're seeing from the Center for Urban Research at CUNY, they did this analysis looking at census tracts that have a high concentration of a particular group. And we can use that as a proxy for how well each community is responding to the census. And we can see here for small and medium cities, Asians are doing pretty well. They're doing better than non-Hispanic whites. They're doing better than the overall rates over on the right column. But once you move to larger cities, you see a decline, a pretty steep decline in response rates for the Asian community. And New York City being one of those large cities, we're really concerned about how the Asian community is responding to the census. Part of it is that there's a lot more undocumented immigrants living in cities. There's also the impact of COVID. There's also the impact of the changes in immigration policies at the federal level that are making people more wary about interacting with any federal agency, even though there are lots of protections in place to protect census data from being misused. And we're seeing this in the overall data that looks at immigration. So predominantly foreign-born agents, the bottom line is the one to really look at. Census tracts with predominantly foreign-born agents are underperforming census tracts that are predominantly native-born Asians. And so you're seeing the impact. You see this similar impact in other communities where there are a lot of immigrants. And then overall, I mentioned before, New York City as a whole, these are the top 10 cities, also happen to be the cities with a million more population, and New York City is near the bottom of that pile. These are all some of these areas. New York has been really impacted by COVID, and community groups that had intended to be out in the streets going and interacting with people in person to encourage them to fill out the census and helping them fill out the census have been unable to do this work. And so we are looking for innovative ways to do a lot of these things virtually, and certainly are looking for people to with interesting ideas to help us figure out how to reach more people. And so I'll leave it at that and open it up to questions. Thank you again.
Thanks, Howard.
Okay.
Awesome. Howard, thank you so much for the great visuals and going over the data and the numbers, especially in the Asian American population. So we'll be going over to the Q&A portion of our event now. And for this, if the participants can just enter the questions into the chat in the Zoom, we could go from there, and we could be selecting questions to answer out of there. So I'll give everyone a couple minutes to think up your questions and put them in the chat. And in the meantime, I'll just kick it off with one, going back to Liz. Liz, I know you mentioned something about the Asian Pacific American Complete Count Committee. Do you mind telling us a bit more about that and what they do?
Sure. It's a coalition of 17 different Asian Pacific American groups who are engaged in trying to get an accurate count of Asian Americans across the city. And if you go to www.apacc.org, you will see the 17 different organizations listed, what they do, etc. And so we've been holding the APACCC trainings, leading up to the April 1st, 2020 census release to educate community-based organizations and the community at large that the census is coming, and to be aware of it, how to complete it, etc. And now you guys can imagine the Herculean effort to do census outreach amid COVID-19, when we cannot go door-to-door knocking, we cannot be on the street leafleting because of stay-at-home rules and social distancing. And it has killed, in many ways, our efforts to get the word out. Just to show you how creative we are being. We are going to grocery stores that are open now and getting the buy-in of store owners to agree to put our flyer about how census is related to COVID-19 in all the bags when people check out. We've been asking food banks that are holding food banks around the city for people who can't get food to put our flyer in that food bank. We've been calling the voter activation network to reach Asian Americans in Sunset Park and Bensonhurst, areas where Howard is going to talk more about at that forum, where there is even less than a 47% response rate. We've been putting articles on WeChat and social media to reach Asian American populations on the importance of the census. But we are behind, and it is going to be devastating to our communities now in the next 10 years, particularly when we talk about civic participation. And this is going on at a time when United States will be a majority minority country by 2050. So, you know, we could be a majority, but if our numbers don't show it, if the statistics don't show it, if the census doesn't show it, we are not going to be able to maximize our numbers.
Got it. Thank you so much, Liz. I see a bunch of questions coming in through the chat. So we have one for Howard. You mentioned that immigrants tend to be more cautious about doing the census. So what can we do to help encourage participation? Maybe, for us in the audience as well.
I think the biggest challenge is it has to be almost word of mouth, right? So we have to be able to have a relationship with those immigrants and be able to tell them that it's safe and secure and that it's actually really beneficial for them and their families to participate in the census. And the challenge is that, Liz pointed out that we can't do a lot of this in-person stuff. So we're relying on, more than ever now on people's existing networks to be able to reach out to people. One of the things that I think all of us as advocates for the census have been telling people, and I've been trying to model, is say, if you filled out the census, great. That's a perfect first step, but you also need to reach out to 3 to 5 other people or other families, particularly ones that are probably feeling vulnerable in this environment, and asking them if they need help filling out the census and why it's important, and talk to them about why it's important to fill out the census. It's important for schools, it's important for the hospitals, it's important for transportation and access to benefits and things like that. So I think it all comes down to how we can, each of us as individuals, reach out to members of our community and really encourage them to participate in the census.
And particularly the churches. It's been difficult to reach the churches, and they are beginning services virtually online if they will allow for an announcement to be made. Churches, and especially Asian churches, they think it's political, and so church shouldn't be involved in political. The census is nonpartisan. It's one of the few things that our entire country needs to be unified on, whether Democrat, Republic, everybody counts. And so, in Black churches, they get it. And, they've been, actively announcing it and, helping to publicize it and so forth. But, we need to be able to reach the churches, because what's open now, right? Supermarkets, churches, giving, virtual services, and things like that. And one thing we forgot to mention is, my fault, is New York is estimated to lose 1 congressional seat because of population shifts. More people are moving down south. So if the South has more people, they will get more congressional seats. However, we stand to lose 2 congressional seats if there is an undercount. And more than 20,000 people have died as a result of the virus in New York City. Will they be counted now? And, so this is really critical. And I teach you guys at college, and so many people that I have called on the phone, elderly or older, not even elderly, my age, I'm going to be 60 this year, have said, I'm waiting for my child to come home to help me complete the census. I don't know how to do it online. I'm waiting for my kid to come home to help me, And so it's really critical to ask, like Howard said, ask your family, have they completed it? Ask your relatives, have they completed it? Your neighbors, etc. It's just really key in your networks, project by project. Other clubs that you're part of, have people completed the census? It's really critical.
Right. Totally agree with you. Word of mouth can be very powerful, and I myself actually reached out to my family not too long ago, making sure we did the census. So totally get you on that. But going back to the sensitivity or the perceived sensitivity, is the information kept confidential in the census for those who are concerned?
Yes. As a result of the Census Bureau leaking information, individualized information about persons of Japanese descent that led to the internment of over 100,000 Japanese Americans during World War II, then a law was passed that census workers can get up to 5 years in jail and an approximately $250,000 fine if they leak any individualized information about anyone. So by law, they are prohibited from doing it. That's number one. Number two, our communities, many of you on this call may have been part of it. We led a successful grassroots campaign through the courts to get the citizenship question off the 2020 census. Unprecedented, the US Supreme Court ruled that the question must come off because this administration lied about their intention as to why they wanted to keep the citizenship question on there. It was revealed through the lawsuit that they wanted the question on there to chill Latino participation. So Latinos would not participate in the census, and therefore they could draw districting lines that benefited the Republican Party. So it is really critical that we complete the census. We will be invisible if we don't, and we will not maximize our growing population.
Just to clarify, I think Liz said keep the question on. Just to clarify that this question was being added on, and then there was a ruling to keep it on, and then the Supreme Court decided to take it off. So I just want to set the status quo was that the question was never on this, hasn't been on the census form for probably 60, 70 years.
Correct.
Yeah.
Got it. Understood. And I think this question is relevant for the summer time frame where a lot of people are moving. What if you're moving and don't currently have a permanent address? What is that like?
It's based on where you were living on April 1st. That's the reference date. So if you were, if you moved after April 1st, it's where you were living on April 1st. If you moved before April 1st, it's where you were. It becomes more difficult, particularly if people are in strange housing, in different unexpected housing arrangements, particularly college students. The guidance is that college students should be reporting where they would have been if classes were still in session. So on their college campuses, either off campus or on campus housing, not back home where they are now. And so things get a little bit more complicated given the times we're in, but it's mostly where the law, I think the best way to think about it is you need to respond to the census where you are going to draw the most community services, whether you're driving on the roads, whether you're going to the supermarket, going to the doctors. You got to be responding to where you are in that particular community. And so that's, I think that's probably the best guideline I can say to people. And then there's a whole website on the Census Bureau that gives all sorts of detailed particular cases and special things like that. But in general, it's where you believe you will be using, where do you feel you're part of a community?
Got it. Thank you for clarifying. So we'll do a couple more quick questions. I know we're a little over, but speaking about the community, do we have a sense of the age group within the Asian community that's least likely to fill out the census? Is it maybe the older generation due to a language barrier, or maybe the younger generation for lack of understanding of the importance of the census? Do you have a sense of which is least likely?
Um, so, young children between the ages of 0 to 5 are actually one of the most undercounted portions of the community. And so there's that, because, first of all, they probably won't be able to fill out the census on their own. But, for some reason, whether it's because of different housing situations or divorce and things like that, those young children are often missed in counts. That being said, we as the community advocates have had a worry about this being the first widespread internet-based census ever, that seniors are, they've been through multiple censuses in a lot of cases and are expecting a form in the mail and didn't get one until probably within the last couple of weeks. And so and then on top of that, there are no paper forms in a lot of the Asian languages that traditionally had paper forms, and everything is online. So we're worried about language access and digital literacy for our seniors. And one of the challenging things is that with our senior centers closed, we haven't been able to ask or access seniors and figure out what's actually happening in the community, and we have to rely on the data maps that I was showing you, and that doesn't actually tell us where seniors are living and that kind of thing.
Right.
That actually is giving me an idea, though. Thanks.
So going back to that really quick, what are some resources we can direct people to help immigrants and those with limited English?
Okay, some is, if you go to www.apaccc.org, we have various flyers, information, fact sheets, different languages that could be of help. On a national level, there are Advancing Justice has a resource link to the census, as well as other materials. American Federation has great materials too, that are bilingual and in multiple different languages too. The census itself has some, they have 59 languages, instructions on how to complete the census in 59 different languages, pamphlets that are available through its website is also there. So those are some ways. But again, what I would really encourage you guys in your networks, like you're doing today, which is really commendable. Other sports clubs, business organizations, religious, particularly the churches, to ask your pastor or your religious leader, can you make an announcement on the importance of completing the census? Very, very critical. And for anybody on this call, which I know some have indicated that they have completed the census, which is great. If you could email me your address and zip code, I can count you towards the Museum of Chinese in America's deliverables, and that's really key. My email is lizouyang@aol.com. They have committed to trying to get at least 2,500 APAs to complete the census in the city. And so your numbers would be helpful.
Got it. Thank you, Liz. So we'll wrap it up with one last question. I know we're a bit over. So the question we have is, does race and ethnicity affect things such as congressional seats and funding? And a second part of that question would be, why does the census have a separate section for ethnicity, which is for only Hispanic/Latino, and race, which is considered white, Black, Asian, Native American, etc.? And I think that's kind of a general question, as that appears in not only the census but other surveys as well. So if either of you guys could get that.
Okay, the first is race and ethnicity does not impact the number of congressional seats. What impacts the number of congressional seats is the number of people completing the census overall. However, funding makes a difference when you click off race in certain ways, because as Howard said, the base census is the decennial census. Then they do additional surveys selecting people who have completed the decennial census. So for instance, if you complete it and you check off Taiwan, if you put down Korean, for instance, then they may send a separate, smaller survey to a sample of people who checked off Korean to find out more information about health issues impacting the Korean community, language issues, etc. And then funding does come into play, because as you guys may know, when you go to the voting booths in New York City, you see in certain voting precincts bilingual information in Chinese, Korean, and maybe now certain South Asian languages. But that's based on the census, okay? Smaller surveys that they send out to a segment of the people who completed the larger survey, who are from a specific ethnicity. And so if a certain number, complete it and have English below a certain level, then, depending on how many they are in that area, may be eligible for bilingual ballots. And then funding becomes an issue. If they're eligible, then the government's got to supply it. And so funding decisions are made along those lines. And so it does impact with respect to not only bilingual ballots, bilingual education and resources for bilingual education, and other programs like that. Okay, Howard, you want to take the second one about why race and why ethnicity questions?
Sure. Just to summarize what Liz was saying, race and ethnicity doesn't affect the size of the pie, but affects how we divvy up the pie of how, who represents us in congressional and electoral districts and how, funding that's allocated by the federal government to the states is divvied up among communities. So the second question is, it's just basically a historical artifact. Race is a social construct in the United States. The Census Bureau, in 1970, when they introduced the Hispanic question, I think it was 1970, basically it was created as separate from, the whole racial construct. There was actually an effort after the 2010 census to introduce a revised race and ethnic question, which combined race and ethnicity into one question to really, because a lot of Hispanics, frankly, they either check, like they mentioned in the question, choose white or black. A lot of them actually pick some other race because they don't identify as either white or black exclusively. And so there was an effort to do that. It went to the GAO, and then Trump became president and killed the effort. It would have actually also introduced the Middle Eastern, North African category as well to help the Arab community better quantify their community needs. And so, that's what happened. So it's the census asks because the federal government through the General Accounting Office decides what guidelines, what are the statistical guidelines that every federal agency has to follow. And the Census Bureau had proposed new guidelines, and they were rejected. So,
got it. Thank you for clarifying. So, thanks everyone for entering our questions into the chat. Now, let me just wrap up by thanking everyone for joining this call and your interest in learning more about the census. And hopefully, we were able to demystify, what the census is all about. And of course, thank you to our guest speakers, Howard Shih and Liz OuYang. And you know,
Thank you.
if you if you took away anything from this event, I think, one thing to take away is the census is so much more than just a number, and there's a lot that go into it, and there's a lot of outcomes as a result. So, like Liz and Howard are promoting, definitely, spread the word of mouth, do your part in getting our community a voice. So I'd like to close by saying, if you'd like to further support Project by Project and other initiatives, definitely check out our website, where you'll also find a link to donate to our organization as well. And with that, we will conclude this event. Thanks everyone for joining.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay.
All right. Thanks,
Bye.
guys.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Good
Yep.
job.
You too.
Okay. Bye.